I didn't lose my husband. He didn't cheat. He didn't leave. He just stopped treating me like someone whose presence mattered. And the worst part, I stayed long enough to start believing that was normal. People think betrayal is loud. Affairs, lies, explosions. This wasn't that. This was quieter, cleaner, harder to explain. We slept in the same bed, ate at the same table, shared the same life on paper. But emotionally, I was already living alone. And the reason it took me so long to notice was because nothing technically went wrong. No proof, no villain, no moment I could point to and say, here, this is where it ended. So instead, I kept adjusting myself until there was almost nothing left to adjust. Here's how it actually starts. Not with a fight, not with a confession, but with small decisions you're no longer part of. At first, nothing feels wrong enough to confront. He still comes home on time, still asks if you've eaten, still sleeps beside you, close enough to confuse you into thinking intimacy is still there. That's what makes this so hard to name, because on the surface, everything looks fine. But then you notice something subtle. Plans exist before you hear about them. Decisions are already made by the time your opinion could matter. Not big things, small things, the kind people dismiss when you try to explain them. A dinner you weren't invited to, a weekend plan mentioned casually as if you were always supposed to know, a family conversation that happened without you in the room. And when you ask, there's no argument, no anger, no defensiveness, just confusion, like your expectation to be included never even crossed his mind. You wouldn't have cared. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think you'd want to be involved. Listen carefully to those sentences. They don't attack you. They erase you. Because the message isn't that you were unwanted. It's that you were irrelevant. And since there's no cruelty in his tone, you don't accuse him. You adjust yourself instead. You stop asking questions that seem to slow him down. You stop sharing thoughts he doesn't respond to. You stop interrupting moments where your presence feels like an inconvenience. You learn how to sit next to someone who is physically there, but mentally elsewhere. Sometimes he's on his phone, smiling. When you ask what's funny, the smile disappears. Nothing, just work. Other times you hear his voice from another room, engaged, animated, alive. With you, the energy is gone. Short answers, flat tones, minimal effort. And slowly, you start wondering what version of yourself became so unnecessary. So you compensate. You become easier, more agreeable, less demanding. You cook what he likes. You keep things running. You stay understanding. You tell yourself that being low maintenance will make you easier to love. But that's the trap, because the less you require, the less you're considered, and without realizing it, you stop being someone he chooses and become someone he simply assumes will always be there. This is where it gets confusing, because he's still there, just not in ways that require effort. He listens, but only enough to respond, not enough to understand. You talk about your day, and he offers solutions you didn't ask for, fixes, logistics, efficiency. No curiosity, no follow-up, no, how did that make you feel? The conversation ends before it ever really begins. And when you finally say something, when you try to explain the distance, he stays calm. Too calm. I don't know what you mean. You're reading into things. Nothing has changed. Notice what's missing. No questions, no concern, no pause to reflect. Just dismissal, delivered softly enough that you question yourself instead. Because there's no explosion, no cruelty you can quote, no moment dramatic enough to justify how bad you feel. So you assume the problem must be you. Maybe you're too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. He never says those words. He doesn't have to. You hear them in the sigh when you talk too long, in the way his eyes drift away mid-sentence, in the silence that follows your honesty. So you start editing yourself in real time. You shorten stories, soften opinions, swallow feelings before they become inconvenient. You become easier to be around. Not happier, just quieter. And the quieter you get, the less space you occupy. That's when you notice something else. He starts sharing his thoughts with other people, not you. You find out later, through casual mentions, through plans that are already agreed on, through decisions that somehow never required your input. When you ask why he didn't tell you, he shrugs. I didn't think you'd care. That sentence does more damage than any argument ever could. Because you did care. You cared enough to slowly disappear. You convince yourself that love doesn't need attention, that partnership doesn't require presence, that loneliness is just part of adulthood. At night, lying inches away from him, you feel like someone who stayed too long. He isn't cruel, he isn't openly unfaithful, but he's absent in a way that teaches you to stop reaching. And that's the dangerous part. Because he's not pushing you away, he's watching to see how little he can give before you stop asking altogether. The moment that changes everything never looks important when it happens. No argument, no raised voices, no dramatic realization, just a quiet observation you can't unsee once it lands. We were sitting at the same table, eating dinner. He was talking, engaged, expressive, almost energized, but not with me. He was on the phone, laughing, sharing details about his day I was hearing for the first time. When the call ended, the energy disappeared. The room went flat again. I waited for him to continue, to turn back toward me, to include me. He didn't. And in that silence, something finally clicked. He wasn't emotionally unavailable, he was selectively present. That distinction matters, because it means this wasn't stress, it wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't distraction. He had the capacity, he just chose where to use it. Once I saw that, I couldn't stop noticing the pattern, how his phone stayed in his hand when I spoke, but disappeared when others did, how he remembered their stories and forgot mine, how my emotions felt like interruptions, while theirs felt engaging. When I tried to explain it, carefully, he smiled. Soft, almost gentle. You're overthinking again. You make everything so heavy. Those words landed differently, because what he was calling heavy was my need to matter. So I stopped giving him anything he could minimize. I stopped sharing hurt, stopped asking for reassurance, stopped explaining myself. I learned how to survive on the smallest signals. A nod, a brief response, a moment of eye contact. And when those moments came, I felt relieved, grateful. That realization scared me more than the distance itself, because why should love feel like something you're lucky to receive? That's when the harder questions surfaced. Why was I trying so hard to be chosen by someone who already had me? Why did being loved feel like a performance I could fail at any moment? The answer came slowly. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He benefited from my silence, from my flexibility, from my self-doubt. As long as I questioned myself, he never had to examine his behavior. That was the betrayal. Not another person, not a single event, but the decision to let me shrink, because my shrinking made his life easier. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back. Once I understood what was happening, I stopped trying to fix it. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally saw how much of myself I'd already given away trying to be understood. I noticed how often I was doing the work for both of us, explaining my feelings before he asked, softening them before they became inconvenient, apologizing for having them at all. I was carrying the emotional weight in a relationship where only one of us still needed comfort. So I stopped. No confrontation, no dramatic speeches, no demands.
I simply became still. I stopped reminding him of the things that mattered to me, stopped checking his mood before checking my own, stopped filling silences that weren't mine to carry. And something revealing happened. Nothing. He didn't panic. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't lean in. He barely noticed. That told me everything. The distance hadn't started when I went quiet. It had been there the entire time. I'd just been the one bridging it. Once I stopped doing that, the gap became visible. I started paying attention to what this relationship was costing me. The constant self-monitoring, the anxiety around my words, the loneliness of existing next to someone who had already checked out emotionally. I realized something painful. I wasn't losing him. I was losing myself trying to keep him comfortable. And for the first time, I asked a different question. Not, how do I make this work, but why am I the only one trying? That question didn't require an answer from him. It required honesty from me. Love doesn't disappear suddenly. It withdraws in small, quiet pieces until the person left behind starts believing they're asking for too much. I wasn't. I was asking the wrong person. He didn't leave. He didn't explode the relationship. He stayed and taught me what it feels like to be alone while still being partnered. That was the moment I stopped explaining myself. Because when someone truly wants to understand you, they don't need you to keep proving that you deserve to be heard.
If you made it this far, it's probably because something in this story felt familiar. Not explosive, not dramatic, just quietly accurate. Some relationships don't end with shouting or slammed doors. They end with you slowly adjusting yourself until one day you realize you've been living next to someone who no longer sees you. If you've ever felt lonely in a relationship you are trying to protect, if you've ever minimized your needs just to avoid being called too much, if you've ever questioned whether you were asking for something unreasonable, you weren't, and you weren't imagining it. This channel exists for the stories that don't leave evidence, the kind of emotional distance that's easy to dismiss from the outside and devastating to live through on the inside. If these stories resonate with you, consider subscribing, not for drama, not for noise, but for clarity. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin when someone admits what they did. It begins when you finally trust what you felt.